What is going on, guys? Hyper here, and I hope you're all excited because Blizzard finally pushed the Unholy DK changes which we were promised on the BFA Beta. I will go over all of the talents and spells which have been removed, added, or changed in any way. Then at the end of the video I will show you one or two builds which I think are kind of fun to play, and also have a short discussion about what I think about these changes. First of all, we have Sludge Belcher completely removed as a talent, which I'm kind of happy about because the extra hook felt kind of awkward and it didn't really work properly some of the times. And also, Sludge Belcher also gained a DPS increase, overtaking the regular pet. And Wraithwalk was removed as a baseline ability and made into a talent. I will talk about this later when I get to it. This also means that Lingering Apparition was completely removed as a talent. Then we have Blighted Rune Weapon, which again was removed, but components of it were incorporated into Unholy Frenzy, which is a new talent that we got. Then Castigator was also removed, which I mentioned that is a problematic talent because it scales with crit, and Death Knight in general, Unholy Death Knight, does not scale well with that stat, so I'm glad to see this gone. Then Dark Arbiter was also removed, but components of it were incorporated into Gargoyle. Then Necrosis, which made us weave our death coils, also was removed completely. The last talent which was removed is Corpse Shield, and this saw quite a bit of use in PvP, but not so much in PvE. Next, let's go over all of the talents and abilities which we gained, because there's quite a few of them. First of all, no surprise to anyone, Apocalypse is now baseline, but they changed it to burst 4 Festering Wounds instead of 6 like it does on live. And on live servers, you burst 4 Festering Wounds in PvP. This does feel somewhat better to use because they kind of changed around how the Festering Wound system works to make it less RNG and feel a little bit more fluid. As for the new talents which we gained, in the tier 2 row, we gained Inevitable Doom. This talent incorporates the Legion artifact trait, which allows you to store up to 2 charges of Death Coil and gives you a 15% increased chance to proc Sudden Doom. In the tier 3 row, we gained Unholy Blight, and this works similar to how we did in previous iterations. Applies the dot to mobs around yourself and it deals shadow damage. And it's also a 1 minute cooldown, down from 130, which it was in the previous expansions. In the tier 4 row, we gained Death's Reach, and this used to be a glyph in previous expansions where whenever you kill someone or a mob which gave you experience or honor, then your death grip instantly reset. And now on top of that, we also get a 5-yard extension on our death grip. Currently this is bugged, so I cannot show you footage of how this works. In the tier 5 row, we gain Death Pact, and this heals you for 50% of your max HP, but you gain an Absorb Shield for incoming heals for 30% of your max HP. And also, it's important to note that this does not sacrifice your pet, because Death Pact in previous expansions did have iterations of it, where you had to have your pet out, and then whenever you pressed it, it just instantly sacrificed your pet for HP. Also in the 5th tier, we have Wraithwalk. Like I mentioned before, this is now a talent. It works basically the same as on live, it's a channeled ability, but it does last 4 seconds instead of 3, but the cooldown of it went from 45 seconds to 1 minute. Then in the tier 6 row, we have Corpse Explosion. And this was also an artifact trait in Legion called Portal to the Underworld, where whenever your ghouls from Army of the Dead or Apocalypse expired, they exploded and dealt damage to everything around them. In the last tier, we have Unholy Frenzy. Like I mentioned before, this works similar to Blighted Rune Weapon, but this ability applies wounds based on how many times you attack in the window where you have it active. And it also does give you 20% haste, which is quite nice. Summon Gargoyle is now a talent, and it gained the damage scaling of Dark Arbiter. However, instead of gaining 1% damage for every runic power you spend, you gain 1% for every 2 runic power. However, Gargoyle lasts 30 seconds, but it is on a 3-minute cooldown, rather than Dark Arbiter, which lasts 20 seconds and it was on a 2-minute cooldown. Now that we talked about everything that was added and removed, let's mention everything that was changed. Army of the Dead CD was reduced to 8 minutes from 10 minutes, and this still doesn't give us multiple armies throughout the fight, but it is kind of a nice improvement if you go for like Mythic Plus, or on longer fights you might be able to get 2 in. Death's Advance now also grants 30% movement speed for 8 seconds. So since Wraith Walk was made into a talent, it's quite nice to see that DA actually gives us movement speed. The Dark Transformation uptime was reduced to 15 seconds from 20, which is baseline. Next, Death Coil runic power cost was reduced to 40 from 45, with promises of further tuning depending on how our resources look in this expansion. And also, it reduces the cooldown of your Dark Transformation by 1 second every time you cast Death Coil. And this is just baseline. Festering Strike now applies 2 to 3 wounds instead of 2 to 4. And the maximum amount of Festering wounds you can have on the target is 6, down from 8. Raise Dead is now on a 30-second cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown. All Will Serve had the instant pet res part removed. So in Legion, the way it worked, whenever you took this talent, if your pet died, you were able to instantly resummon it, and there was no 1-minute cooldown on your Raised Dead. And that part was completely removed from it. The bursting source damage was changed from 50% to 25%. So that was a 50% nerf on it overall. Defile had its mastery component removed, but now it grows in size if it hits enemies. Ebon Fever is down to a 15% damage increase from a 20%, which I'm quite surprised to see because I mentioned in my Unholy DK video that this talent needed a buff, since it didn't synergize with our Plague Bearer trait, which we have in Legion. Epidemic was changed to cost 30 runic power instead of 1 rune. There are no charges on it, and it is now an AoE runic power spender, which is quite nice to see, and I really like this rework so far. Pestilent Pustules now, instead of generating 1 rune every 8 wounds burst, it has a 10% chance to trigger runic corruption every time you burst a wound. And of course, if you burst 4 at the same time like you do with Apocalypse, those add together and you have a 40% chance of triggering your runic corruption. Dark Infusion works similar to Shadow Infusion, however you get the CDR even when your pet is transformed. And it is 3 seconds per Death Coil, plus you get the 1 second which is incorporated already into Death Coil. So every time you Death Coil, if you have this talent taken, you reduce the cooldown by 4 seconds. The nice thing about this talent is that it also works with Epidemic. So on AoE you don't have to sacrifice that CDR, and in this talent road this seems to be one of the more AoE focused talents. Then Soul Reaper was changed to be a dot, and it generates 1 rune on use, granting you 10% haste for 8 seconds if the target dies within the dot window. And it is on a 45-second cooldown. I think this is way undertuned, and I really hope they address it in the future. I went through these changes rather quickly, but if you want to read through these, just go to Wowhead and they have a great post where it sums up all of the changes which we saw in this build. So now that you know how Unholy DK works and what the abilities do, let's talk a little bit about the new talent setups and if this is a good or bad change overall. So the first talent row is interesting. It revolves around our pet, and then Clawing Shadows is just Clawing Shadows like it was before. So All Will Serve is still absolutely garbage because it counts as a Guardian, and first of all, his auto attacks don't do enough damage to be warranted. It does splash damage when you AoE, so it does 100% damage to the primary target and 50% damage to any subsequent targets. But since it is a Guardian, it's very bad in switching targets, it's very bad in staying in combat when you don't want it to. Overall, this talent just has a lot of problems, and I really wish they addressed this somehow. The only reason you even took this talent in PvP was because it reduced your Raised Dead cooldown to 0, and they completely removed that component from it. So I really want this ability to be reworked in some way because it feels absolutely weak, even on single target. This should be the go-to single target talent because in this first row, we don't really have single target choices. A great way of reworking this, like I mentioned in the previous video, is just give it shadow damage so it scales better with our mastery. Another change they could make to this is to work with our Dark Transformation. Even if it didn't gain the entire bonus of Dark Transformation, it could at least gain 50% of the bonus from it. which would give us kind of a bigger burst windows whenever we DT. Clawing Shadows is same as it is on live, and on single target it will just come down to a straight up sim between this and Infected Claws. But for AoE I feel like Infected Claws is still a little bit better, but Clawing Shadows does give you that range Skirt Strike, so especially in PvP this will be really good, because in PvP you don't really need to get as many wounds up because you rely on burst windows rather than consistent damage most of the time. Then in the second row, this is interesting, this is our rune regeneration row. Pestilent Pustules, like I said before, has a chance to trigger your runic corruption whenever you burst a wound. I thought this would be really good in synergy with Infected Claws, because obviously whenever you have your pet transformed, it applies those wounds to everything in front of it, and then you drop your Death and Decay and you're able to pop all of them. So in theory that works well with Pestilent Pustules, but I actually tried this out in dungeons and it felt extremely underwhelming. Overall, I think this is one of the weaker talent rows that we have. Inevitable Doom synergizes really well with Summon Gargoyle, because obviously we get more Death Coil procs so we can empower it better, and it also synergizes well with Dark Infusion, because we want to remove the CD of our Dark Transformation and we want to lower it as much as we can so we have a maximum uptime of Dark Transformation. Soul Reaper as it stands right now is an extremely weak talent, because the situations where you can actually gain the haste will be rare, and if you're gaining the haste means that you're wasting some of the shadow damage from the dot on it. And also the haste is 10% for 8 seconds. That's absolutely horrible. That's not even half a Cephus. So I really hope that they address this somehow. Maybe if we always gain haste when we Soul Reaper, that would be okay. Or if they actually increase the haste to a point where it could be used in Mythic Plus. But as it stands, this talent is extremely weak. Also, you only generate 1 rune every 45 seconds. Then in the tier 3 row, this is kind of our AoE selection. So we have Unholy Blight, which is on CD, and it is kind of burst AoE that requires no setup. You just press it, run into a pack of mobs, it deals its damage. Bursting Swords is probably better for consistent AoE, where you have time to build up your runes or your wounds on the target, and then pop the wounds, and then build again and pop, and so on, so you can go through your rotation several times. Obviously in like low Mythic Plus dungeons where everything dies quickly, probably Unholy Blight will be the way to go. And then maybe on high keys where you actually have setup time, Bursting Swords seems to do better. Again, this will most likely come down to a simple numbers battle about how many targets you have, first of all, and second of all, how long they live. For single target, it does feel better to use Ebon Fever, but for AoE as it stands right now, it is a non-contender. Then in the level 60 row, DI is still a 50% slow, but now only lasts 3 seconds whenever you press Outbreak. And as it stands right now, it's actually not that bad, because a lot of the slows have been heavily nerfed in the game. And this, as far as percentage goes, is still the same. Death's Reach, obviously leveling talent, and maybe Mythic Plus it will see some use where you can grip multiple mobs, because every time something dies, you're able to grip again. Asphyxiate, go to single target stun, same as in Legion. For the 75, this is our defensive row, defensive/movement row. Death Pact and Spell Eater, situational use again. Spell Eater whenever you need to mitigate spell damage, Death Pact whenever, in every other situation basically, because it does give you the heal. So if you're soloing things, this is quite nice, and it also, if your healer is not able to top you off, this can save you. And then if you don't need the extra defensives, you can also always take Wraith Walk for the extra mobility. One thing with Wraith Walk and Death's Advance, since Death's Advance now does give us a movement speed boost, they do not stack together. So Wraith Walk is a 70%, Death's Advance is a 30%. But when you pop them together, all you go up to is 170. So Wraith Walk overrides the speed boost from Death's Advance, so it is never worth using them together. In the tier 6 row, this is where choices start becoming interesting, because Epidemic is extremely strong on sustained AoE. Unholy DK didn't have an AoE RP spender before, obviously, So adding this to the game completely changes how Unholy DK plays. Now, one thing that it is worth mentioning with Epidemic is that I kind of wish that you got Sudden Doom procs to affect Epidemic. So instead of costing 30 runic power, whenever you have Sudden Doom up, it would cost 0. So it's just a free proc, just like it is on Death Coil. Now, I see why they don't do this. With Sudden Doom actually affecting Epidemic, it would be extremely strong. But even without it, this talent still feels very useful, and in AoE situation, it actually does quite a bit of damage. So they seem to fix the scaling issue on it. And as far as sustained AoE goes, this is the best talent out there in this row. So then in the middle, we have Defile. And this is kind of a halfway point between Corpse Explosion and Epidemic. We don't get the mastery from it anymore, which is kind of unfortunate. And it doesn't do all that much damage. It does about twice the damage of Death and Decay, which is not that much, to be honest. But it is on a 25-second cooldown instead of a 30-second cooldown, like Death and Decay is. It feels like Defile needs something extra. It feels like there's something missing from this talent as it stands right now. We need something else incorporated into Defile to make it compete with the other talents in this row. Then Corpse Explosion, this is the best single target talent that we have so far. I already mentioned what it does. Basically your ghouls from Army and Apocalypse explode when they die. This talent does pull way ahead of Epidemic on AoE, but keep in mind that you will only be able to Army every 8 minutes, and then Apocalypse every 1.5 minutes. So while it pulls ahead in burst, in sustained damage it does fall behind. One thing that will affect if we take Corpse Explosion or Defile, for example, on single target, is the fight length. If you're able to get 2 armies out, Corpse Explosion instantly becomes a go-to. If the fight length is maybe such that we're able to get Defiles out, and there's maybe ads spawning throughout the fight at some points, but obviously you would army at the beginning of the fight so you don't get the explosion onto them, maybe Defile becomes better. And then in the last row, this is an extremely well-designed talent row in my opinion. So Dark Infusion synergizes very well with Infected Claws, obviously, because whenever you have your pet transformed, it cleaves and it applies dots to everything in front of it. This also synergizes well with Inevitable Doom because we're able to get more CDR out of it. And overall, I think it's a very strong talent. Now, I was trying this on a fresh level 120 character, and the scaling at 120 is absolutely busted, so I have like 6% haste. And even then, I'm able to get the Dark Transformation cooldown down from 1 minute to about 15 to 20 seconds, which is actually really insane. Unholy Frenzy, this talent is slightly underwhelming at the moment, but I think that is because it's supposed to synergize well with Soul Reaper and Clawing Shadows. Unholy Frenzy applies dots based on your haste and whenever you auto attack a target. So in theory, you could go in with like Unholy Blight, Soul Reaper, press your Unholy Frenzy, drop your Death and Decay, and just spam Scourge Strikes without having to Festering Strike. At the moment, this is not the case. You still need to Festering Strikes to get wounds up on the target, otherwise you kind of fall behind. But when paired with Infected Claws, it does feel quite good. And you're just it reduces the setup time of your AoE by quite a big margin. And then for single target, obviously it's the 20% haste. So for single target, it will basically come down to Unholy Frenzy or Gargoyle, because it is a 20% haste buff for 12 seconds, and you're also generating runes on the target. But the major thing that will affect this is how much we're able to buff our Gargoyle, and how long the fight lasts, so the number of gargoyles we can get in. Since obviously Unholy Frenzy is only a 1.25 minute cooldown, whereas Gargoyle is a 3 minute cooldown, it is less affected by the fight length. So for Gargoyle, like I mentioned, this will depend on how long the fight goes and how much we're able to actually buff this up. As it stands right now, it's not doing too much damage, but that's mostly because haste scaling and secondary stat scaling in general is very badly broken at max level. So I'm only at like 6 or 7% haste, and I have no mastery. so I'm not able to buff my Gargoyle up as much as we were able to do in Legion, for example. But like we saw in Legion, Dark Arbiter does scale quite heavily with gear, and once you meet those breakpoints, haste breakpoints, where you have a specific number of auto attacks that your pet is able to get in, and you also have high enough haste where you're proccing sudden dooms, and you're able to get a bunch of death coils out, it does pull ahead on single targets. So I'm actually very curious to see the scaling difference going throughout the expansion between Gargoyle and Unholy Frenzy. Some overall thoughts on these changes. For AoE, there's quite a few builds which we can use. Like I mentioned, we have the Infected Claws, Dark Infusion build, which we can again go with Blight if it's burst AoE, or Swords if it's sustained AoE. Or we can go with the Clawing Shadows, Defiled, Unholy Frenzy build. There's quite a few choices here when it comes to AoE, and we have a lot of abilities and talents which add to that AoE toolkit. However, it feels extremely frustrating to play this on single target. I noticed if you go with an AoE build, your single target damage very heavily suffers because of it. And even if you go a single target build, your single target is not all that good yet, because Unholy seems to be scaling with haste. And they removed or they reduced haste scaling and secondary stat scaling at max level by a huge margin compared to Legion. In Legion, they made it so whenever you reached cap, you already had a reasonable amount of stats, secondary stats that is, to make your class feel fluid and good to play. They completely went away from that change and that ideology. As soon as I hit cap, my haste dropped to 6%, even though that's my top stat. This means that Unholy has the potential of scaling once we get high enough secondary stat values. But until then, it doesn't really feel too good to play. Overall, these changes seem to be going in the right direction, but it really seems like there's a desync between the ideology of the team who's designing the stats, the secondary stats, how they scale how much you get, and the team who's working on these talents. Because a lot of these seem to be scaling with haste and mastery heavily, and secondary stats are just completely awful right now. And they didn't really take that into consideration when designing these talents. I'm not entirely sure what the solution to this is, because as it sits right now, it does seem that Unholy DK will be very slow to play when it comes to reaching max level, and then even going into the first raid tier once you have full Mythic Plus gear. I doubt that you will have enough stats for this spec to feel fluid, because I did test this on a 110 where I actually had almost 20% haste, and even on that spec it felt a little bit slow, and having almost 20% haste is pretty high for an Unholy DK, unless you're deliberately stacking haste to reach a breakpoint. As always, I am very interested to hear what your thoughts on these changes are, and what your thoughts on Unholy DK are going into BFA. What do you think should be changed? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and sub to the channel. I'll see you on the next one.